My name's David Firman. I'm a plant scientist, both a physiologist and a pathologist, and I've spent my entire career working on potato, most of it at Cambridge University Farm.
And my name's David Nally. I'm a human geographer with research interests on human-plant interactions and entanglements, with a particular interest in subsistence crises and the history of famines.
My name is Mukesh Kumar. I'm university lecturer in engineering department, basically looking at food supply chain as my research topic. And within food supply chain, I look at food sustainability and resilience.
So I'm interested in the way in which the human and the plant world becomes entangled. And one way to think through that sense of entanglement is with some of the ideas of a philosopher called Michael Marder, who said that when humans encounter a new crop, two worlds collide. So on the one hand, we have the human world, so think of social systems, cultural norms, political doctrines, economic structures. And on the other hand, you have the plant world, so systems of propagation, ecological needs, metabolic systems, that kind of thing. So how do they come together and how do they collide? Now, the object we want to discuss today is the potato, obviously a Peruvian crop that becomes embedded in European culture in the 16th century. And it's interesting to think of the different ways it becomes embedded in European culture. So, for example, social scientists have studied the way in which the potato and its arrival in Europe led to huge population explosion, led to urban expansion, led to industrialization because it's a cheap provider of calories and so on. Therefore, industrial wages could be lower. So there's a sense in which it is intimately linked with the rise of Europe as a global power. Yet, if we look across Europe and look in particular to the fringes of Europe, the potato has a very different social embeddedness. So in somewhere like Ireland, it's not linked with economic growth. It's linked with economic decline. It's linked with demographic collapse in the form of a death-dealing famine. So the Irish famine was in 1845. Roughly about 1 million people die of disease and starvation, and in the decade that ensues, about 2 million other people emigrate. So in the space of a decade, the population loses about a third of its pre-famine population. So an interesting social science question then is, how come the entanglement of this human life world and this plant world produce such different outcomes across European space? Why is Ireland so exceptional?
I think what's really interesting about potato in particular too is how relatively recent it is as a European introduction. You know, it's been domesticated for maybe getting on for 10,000 years, and yet in Europe it's only been hundreds of years, and in developing countries it's tens of years where it's important. So some of the things that you've talked about in relation to the developing world could be quite interesting, you know, as to how cultures will be affected by that. I guess that will be interesting to see what parallels there are developing there.
At the same time, potatoes also become quite embedded in the local culture in developing world, that it almost looks like the potato is actually originated from developing world. Yeah. And if day-to-day life, people don't even think about that this is a foreign species that has come.
I mean, I doubt there are many Europeans who think about the origins and the fact that this is a plant that comes from somewhere completely different, and I'm sure the same will be true of many countries. Yeah, good point. I mean, I guess the Irish had that wasn't part of their interest at all.
I think to give some context, you have to go back in time about maybe 6 or 7 decades before the potato's arrival. I think the key period is Henry VIII's break with Rome, because after that point, Ireland becomes more or less a kind of existential threat to a Protestant polity. So the necessity of subduing Ireland in some sort of way became politically important. And in 1583, there was a localized rebellion in the province of Munster, and Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, and she decided to subdue it, but rather than just suppress the rebels, she also confiscated their land, and she brought over 20,000 settlers and about 35 overlords, and she replanted, hence the policy of plantation. And that was the Munster plantation. And James I continued that policy in Ulster, the big Ulster plantation. Munster plantation was 400,000 acres. The Ulster plantation was 3.8 million acres of land confiscated. The indigenous inhabitants pushed off the land, moved on to marginal lands. And then in the middle of the 17th century, when the potato had arrived, Cromwell arrived with his army and, practiced slash and burn and looting. And, the famous phrase, to hell or to Connacht. So you were either killed and suppressed, or you moved to the furthest regions of the West. So I think what I'm trying to describe here is the beginnings of what today we'd call land poverty. So indigenous ownership at the beginning of the 18th century had fallen to a mere 5%. And if we look at the eve of the famine in 1845, just 10 or maybe 12,000 largely Protestant landowners controlled the entire real estate of Ireland. So you have a nation of owners over 2 centuries through confiscation become a nation of tenants. And it's the crucial context for the adoption of the potato as a plant, because it afforded very significant advantages in conditions of land poverty.
So it's interesting to contrast that history with the more recent history of China. So China is now the world's largest producer of potato, and land ownership is a very different scenario there, but also there would be implications of change in that for how the economy of the potato is influencing people's lives in China, I would imagine.
And how new is the uptake in China?
It's the last few decades, so it's still increasing hugely, and I'm not sure of the date of the introduction of potato into China, but certainly its role as a significant food source is relatively recent, and it's, as I say, still increasing hugely.
And who are the consumers? Is it the rural poor? Is it a commercial crop purchased by urban consumers? Both?
I think it's both. Processing of potato in the urban environment is an increasingly important form of consumption, but it is also consumed in rural communities separately as well. And it's being promoted as a crop with all sorts of benefits. And I think we can probably talk a little bit more about that later in terms of its nutritional quality, but yeah.
And politics is also becoming quite important in growing potatoes these days because of huge commercial organizations getting involved with this.
Yeah.
And the impact that we are seeing, and here is the example of India where a farmer used a particular variety of potatoes given by PepsiCo and looking at commercialization of it, but then suddenly some farmers protested and said like, okay, we'll grow this particular variety
Yes.
without that particular license. Now this is creating a huge impact and bad social media campaign for these big corporations, where some rights are there for commercial organization, but also the poor farmers, those who can't afford even a simple meal a day, a nutritional meal a day, are struggling with these conundrum. And here the politicians don't know how to handle these situations. So I think it looking at the historical side of it and looking at the present, there are some similarities that we are seeing.
That's a very interesting point you make. So the genetic diversity of potato in most of the world is actually very poor. You know, the European introduction, the original introductions were a small number of different varieties, and that obviously led to the risk of disease becoming a problem. We know that a paucity of genetic diversity means that if a particular pathogen comes in and you're growing all the same variety, you're very susceptible to it. And so that has links to the Irish situation. Yeah. And we still have a fairly narrow genetic base. You know, the centre of diversity is obviously the Andes, but we are relying on a very narrow base of genetics, and some of the varieties that we still grow to large volumes are more than 100 years old. In fact, plant breeding in potato is arguably been rather unsuccessful. We are amazingly relying on a potato that has not evolved greatly under human management from the wild. So that's, the point about the commercial developments is quite an interesting one.